Every retirement plan sounds simple until someone else starts adding line items to it. Some men picture golf, some men picture grandchildren. Dennis pictured a plastic chair, a cold beer, and a sky doing something spectacular over the South China Sea. He wrote the whole plan on the back of a beer coaster once, half joking, and for a while it actually worked exactly the way he'd written it. Then a woman moved in, and so, without anyone ever discussing it out loud, did 5 other people. This is the story of how a man who spent his whole working life fixing what other people broke ended up funding a household he never once agreed to build. I flew a plastic chair worth of expectations out to La Union 18 months after I closed my plumbing business in Brisbane. 38 years unblocking other people's pipes will do something to a man's back and his patience in roughly equal measure, and by the time I sold the business I wasn't chasing adventure, I was chasing quiet. My marriage to Cheryl had ended 9 years earlier. No drama in it by then. Just 2 people who'd stopped being anything to each other, except co-signers on a mortgage. And my son Craig was grown and settled in Melbourne, with a wife and a mortgage of his own. There wasn't much keeping me in Brisbane except habit. My super and my pension worked out to about 2,600 Australian dollars a month, once I ran the numbers properly, with an advisor I trusted, which isn't a fortune, but in a beach town in La Union it goes a long way, or it's supposed to. I wrote the plan on a coaster in a pub in Fortitude Valley the week before I left, half showing off to my mate Colin, half convincing myself. Surf in the morning, beer at sunset, rent, food, the occasional flight home to see Craig and the grandkids once they arrived. That was the whole plan, written in blue biro on cardboard, and Colin laughed and said, "You've reduced 40 years of marriage and mortgage stress down to a beer coaster, Dennis. Good on you." I kept that coaster in my wallet for the first year I was out here, a little cracked and soft from being carried around, a reminder of how uncomplicated I wanted the second half of my life to be. For 8 months, it held up almost exactly as written. I met Lorna at a beachfront cafe 3 weeks after I arrived, back when I still burned red in an hour, and everyone local found that hilarious, calling out, "Sunburn na naman," whenever I walked past with my shoulders peeling. She was 33, worked shifts at a resort further down the coast doing guest relations, and had a laugh that carried across the whole open-air dining area, the kind of laugh that made strangers turn and smile without knowing why. She sat with me because the cafe was full and I was alone, at a foretop with a paperback I wasn't really reading, and within 20 minutes I'd told her more about my divorce from Cheryl than I'd told most people back home in a decade. There's something about being somewhere nobody knows your history that loosens a man's tongue. She listened well. She didn't try to fix anything or offer advice. She just nodded and asked small, careful questions that showed she'd actually been listening, not just waiting for her turn to talk. When I told her I was retired and on my own out here, she tilted her head and said, "That's brave, Dennis. Most people your age are too scared to start again." I've thought about that line a lot since. At the time it felt like a compliment, the kind that lands right in the soft part of a man who spent a year wondering if he'd made a mistake leaving everything familiar behind. Later it felt like an assessment, the way a tradesman looks at a job before he quotes it. We saw each other 3 more times that first week, always at her suggestion, always somewhere she picked, and I found myself looking forward to those meetings the way I hadn't looked forward to anything in years. She'd bring small things, a mango from the market, a story about a rude guest at the resort, a question about Australia that showed she'd been thinking about me between our meetings. I told Colin about her over a bad phone line, and he asked the obvious question, the one every mate asks, half joking and half not. "How old is she, mate?" And when I told him 33, he went quiet for a second before saying, carefully, "Just keep your eyes open, that's all." I told him he didn't understand, that this felt different, that she wasn't after anything. She had her own job, and her own life, and hadn't asked me for a single thing. That was true, at the time. I want that on the record. For a long while it was completely true. We were properly together within 2 months, and she moved into my rented apartment about 6 months after that, once the lease on her old place ran out, and it made sense, her words, to combine costs. I remember being pleased about that phrase. Combine costs. It sounded like a partnership, like two people building something practical together, instead of one lonely Australian throwing money at a beach fantasy. For the first while, it genuinely was. Lorna cooked most nights, real Ilocano dishes, pinakbet and bagnet that she taught me to eat properly with my hands. And she knew which market stalls didn't overcharge foreigners the moment they heard an Australian accent. She taught me maybe 40 words of Ilocano that I still mangle to this day, and she'd laugh, not unkindly, every time I got the tones wrong. My son Craig video called me one Sunday and said I looked 10 years younger, and I believed him, because I felt it too. I remember standing on our little balcony that evening after the call, watching the sky do the thing I'd written on that coaster, and thinking, for the first time in a long time, that I'd landed somewhere good. The first addition to the household arrived so quietly, I didn't clock it as an addition at all. Lorna's cousin Bing started coming by twice a week to help with laundry and cleaning, because, Lorna explained one evening while folding a basket of towels, in her family, you don't let a cousin go without work if you can give her some. And besides, my back wasn't what it used to be for scrubbing floors on my knees. She's a hard worker, Dennis, and she has a baby now. No husband around, Lorna said, and I remember nodding along, thinking about my own daughter-in-law back in Melbourne juggling a newborn, and feeling a rush of something like solidarity with a woman I'd never met. I paid Bing 150 Australian dollars a month, which felt fair, even generous, for the hours she put in, and she was genuinely good at her job, quiet and efficient, always finished before I got back from my morning surf. I didn't think of it as payroll. I thought of it as helping someone out while getting my floors cleaned, which is exactly how it was framed to me. And framing matters more than people realize when you're a man who wants very badly to be seen as generous rather than gullible. Then came the kuya. That's what Lorna called him, an older brother figure, though he wasn't related to her at all. A wiry fellow named Randy, who drove a battered little multicab with a cracked windscreen and a rosary hanging from the mirror. He started ferrying us to the market, to appointments, to dinners further down the coast, because, Lorna pointed out one hot afternoon, as we waited for a tricycle that never came, I shouldn't be walking long distances in the heat at my age, and tricycles overcharge foreigners anyway. Everybody knew that. Randy is honest, Dennis. He won't cheat you like the others, she said, and I remember thinking that sounded like exactly the kind of reassurance a con man's introduction would come with, and then immediately feeling guilty for thinking it, because Randy turned out to be, by every measure I could see, a genuinely decent bloke. $200 a month, cash, no receipt, no real schedule beyond whenever we needed him, which in practice was most days. I want to be honest and say I liked Randy. He was good company on those drives. He told me stories about fishing typhoons he'd survived as a younger man, and he fixed my gate hinge once without being asked, refusing to take extra money for it, which somehow made the whole arrangement feel even more legitimate to me. For a long while, I told myself this was just how things worked here, a kind of informal economy of favors and loyalty that a foreigner like me was lucky to be let into, rather than a foreigner like me being quietly onboarded as the funding source for an entire extended family's employment. The pattern kept extending outward, the way water finds every low point in a floor before you've even noticed the floor wasn't level. Lorna's younger sister Precious, 26, sharp and ambitious in a way I actually admired, set up an online shop selling skincare and supplements, running the whole operation out of our living room, boxes stacked against the wall where I used to keep my fishing gear. It's a good business, Dennis. Everyone is buying skincare online now. I've seen the numbers, Precious told me over dinner one night, laying out a business case with more confidence than some of the apprentices I'd trained over the years. She needed capital for inventory. $2,000 the first time, another $1,500 the second, framed each time as an investment that would pay me back within a few months once the orders came in. Just this last batch, Kuya Dennis, then I don't need anything more from you, she said, twice, and I believed her both times. The orders were always about to come in. I'd see the boxes shrink a little, then grow again, and I stopped asking for the numbers she'd promised to show me, because asking felt like accusing a young woman of lying to my face, and I didn't want to be that kind of man. Lorna's mother, Nena, back in a barangay an hour inland, received a monthly allowance of $300 that I only found out I was funding when I asked, mildly, over a grocery receipt, why our joint budget kept running short before the month ended. Lorna's face changed the way it always did when money came up directly instead of sideways. "She's my mother, Dennis," she said, in a tone that made the question itself feel like the offense, like I'd ask something no decent person would ask. "In our culture, we take care of our parents. Is that not normal where you come from?" I didn't have a good answer for that in the moment, because on its face it sounded reasonable, even admirable, and it took me a long time to separate the reasonable idea, caring for a parent, from the unreasonable reality, which was that I'd never once been asked, only informed after the fact, and that the amount only ever went up, never down, no matter how many other costs stacked on top of it. There was fiesta money, a lump sum every year that appeared on the calendar like a tax I hadn't agreed to, $600 the first year for what Lorna called just small contribution everyone gives, though I never once saw a breakdown of what it actually paid for. There was load, mobile credit, for what turned out to be 4 different phones across the household, mine, Lorna's, her mother's, and apparently Bing's as well, roughly $120 a month combined, though somehow mine was the account that got charged for all of them, set up early on as "Easier Dennis, one account, no confusion," which in hindsight was one of the more elegant pieces of the whole arrangement. There were birthday gifts for cousins I'd met once at a fiesta and never saw again, a new roof for an uncle's chicken coop after a storm, a medical bill for a relative I only ever knew as Tito, never given a full name. Each individual ask, taken alone, was the kind of thing a generous man says yes to without a second thought. It was only the sum of them, arriving month after month, that I never once sat down to calculate. Around the same time Precious's shop was expanding, Lorna suggested we drive inland to visit her mother's place for a weekend, something we hadn't done before, despite Nina's name appearing on my banking app every month like clockwork. I said yes readily, glad for the chance to put a face and a house to a name I'd only ever known as a line item, and I told myself that seeing where the money actually went would settle something in me. The house was modest, concrete block with a tin roof, a small yard with chickens and a mango tree, nothing lavish, nothing that suggested anyone was living large off my pension. Nina herself was a small, warm woman who fussed over me the whole visit, insisting I eat more, apologizing for the heat, thanking me over and over for taking care of my Lorna, a phrase that made something in my chest twist a little, because I hadn't realized until she said it that this was how the household understood our relationship. Not 2 people building a life together. Me, taking care of her Lorna, and by extension, taking care of everyone connected to her Lorna. I remember sitting under that mango tree that evening with a warm San Miguel in my hand, watching Lorna laugh with her nieces in the yard, and feeling 2 completely different things at once. Real tenderness for this ordinary, decent family, and a small cold seed of unease I couldn't quite name yet. The sense that I'd been shown a picture designed to make refusal impossible for a man with any conscience at all. None of it arrived as a request, exactly. That's the part I keep trying to explain to people back home, and it's the part they struggle with the most. Nobody sat me down and asked for a monthly commitment. Each cost showed up individually, wearing a perfectly reasonable face, attached to a person I'd come to know, and, in most cases, genuinely like. Saying no to any single one of them would have meant looking Bing in the eye, or Randy, or Lorna's mother, and telling them their small, ordinary need didn't matter to me. I couldn't do it. Not once. I told myself I was being generous. I didn't yet understand I was being staffed. Quietly, one reasonable request at a time, by a household that had learned exactly how far my discomfort could be pushed before it turned into a refusal. There was a night, about 14 months in, that I count now as the first real crack in the fantasy, though at the time I explained it away within the hour. Lorna and I were having dinner at a restaurant up the coast, a rare night without Bing or Randy or anyone else in the picture. Just the two of us, the way it used to be at the start. I mentioned, lightly, over the second beer, that my Brisbane account was lower than I expected for this point in the year, that I might need to tighten up a bit. She went quiet for a second, put her fork down carefully, and said, "You worry too much about money, Dennis. Filipinos don't count like that. We just help each other. Is that so bad, that I come from a family who helps each other?" I remember feeling ashamed, actually ashamed, like I'd exposed something small and ugly in myself by even mentioning a number out loud in front of her. I apologized, more than once. I paid for dinner. I didn't bring it up again for months, and every time the thought resurfaced, I pushed it back down with the same argument I'd been using since Bing's first month on the books, that this was simply how things worked here, and a man who wanted love in a foreign country had to accept the whole package it arrived in. There was another moment, a smaller one, that I didn't understand the weight of until much later. Bing asked for an advance 1 week, 2 months laundry money up front, because her baby needed a hospital visit. Nothing serious, just a checkup with some cost attached. I gave it to her without hesitation. Of course I did. You don't say no to a sick baby. A few days after that, I mentioned the advance to Lorna, mostly just making conversation, and she said, almost absently, folding washing at the time, "Bing does that sometimes. She's smart with money." I asked what she meant. Lorna shrugged and said, "She knows how to ask in a way people don't refuse. It's a skill." I laughed along with her at the time, because it was said so lightly, so without malice, that it registered as an observation about a relative, rather than a description of a method. It was only months later, staring at my own spreadsheet, that the sentence came back to me whole and different. She knows how to ask in a way people don't refuse. It's a skill. I've wondered since whether Lorna was warning me, teasing me, or simply describing, with more honesty than she probably intended, exactly what was happening to me in real time. It took an actual conversation with another expat to shake something loose in me, and I remember the exact moment because it embarrassed me so completely. I was having a beer with Trevor, an easygoing New Zealander who ran a dive shop 2 towns over, a man who'd been out here 11 years and had seen every version of this story from the outside. I mentioned, almost as a throwaway line, some of the monthly costs I was carrying, half boasting, if I'm honest, the way a man does when he wants a mate to admire how well integrated he's become. Trevor put his bottle down slowly and looked at me for a long moment. "Mate," he said, "how many people are on that list again? Say it back to me." I said it back to him. Bing, Randy, Precious, Nina, the phones. He shook his head. "That's not a girlfriend, Dennis. That's a small business with no revenue, and you're the only investor." I laughed it off at the table, told him he didn't understand the culture, the same line I'd used on Colin a year earlier. Trevor just shrugged and said, "Maybe. Or maybe you're the only bloke in this town who hasn't done the sums yet." I didn't laugh about it later that night, lying awake next to Lorna, listening to her breathe, doing math in my head for the first time in almost a year, working in the dark because I didn't want to turn on a light and have to explain to her why I was awake. The next morning, while she was at the resort for a shift, I sat down with a notebook, the closest thing I had to Trevor's blunt honesty, and I wrote down every single recurring cost I could remember. Bing, 150. Randy, 200. Lorna's mother, 300. Load for 4 phones, roughly 120. Precious's shop, an average of 600 a month, once I looked back through my transfers. Since the investments never really stopped, they just changed size and got renamed each time. New packaging, a new supplier, a new opportunity that couldn't wait. Lorna's own personal allowance, which she'd started asking for directly about a year in, framed as fairness since she'd given up extra shifts to take care of the household, 400 a month. I sat at that table for nearly 2 hours, going back through 12 months of transfers on my banking app, and with every scroll I felt something in my chest tighten a little more. The particular kind of shame that comes from realizing you've known a thing for a long time without letting yourself know it. Add the irregular costs, the fiesta money, the birthday gifts for cousins I'd met once, a medical bill for an uncle I'd never met at all, a new roof for the chicken coop, and I landed on a monthly outflow of roughly 3,800 Australian dollars against a pension of 2,600. I sat there in my own kitchen, in the town I'd chosen for its quiet, and understood that for over a year I'd been running at a monthly loss of well over $1,000. Plugged entirely from savings, I'd spent 4 decades building one blocked drain, one sweated pipe joint, one emergency call-out at 3 in the morning at a time. I did the full total next, the number that mattered more than any monthly figure, adding up every transfer since Lorna had moved in, and the figure that came back at me was 61,000 Australian dollars. I read it 3 times, certain I'd made an error somewhere, hoping I had. I hadn't. I didn't say anything to Lorna for almost a week. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't strategy. It was grief. Arriving early, the way it does when you already know a thing is ending before you've said a single word out loud about it. I kept looking at her across the dinner table, at the same laugh that had pulled me in at that beachfront cafe, and I kept trying to work out whether any of it had been separate from the arithmetic, or whether the arithmetic had been the whole relationship wearing a very warm coat the entire time. Some nights I decided it was real, that Lorna herself hadn't set out to build any of this, that it had simply grown up around her the way it grows up around any woman in a family that expects her to provide once she's found someone who can. Other nights I wasn't so generous with myself, and I lay there wondering how much of the girl at the beachfront cafe had been genuine, and how much had been the opening move in something much longer. When I finally showed her the notebook, I'd typed it up properly by then. A clean spreadsheet on my laptop, every name in its own row, every amount, a running monthly total, and the grand total in bold at the bottom, $61,000 in the far column. My honest estimate of everything I'd spent above what I'd have spent living alone on that same pension. I asked her to sit down at the kitchen table with me on a Saturday morning. No one else in the apartment, and I turned the laptop toward her. I didn't say much. I just let her read it. She read it for a long time, longer than the page needed, scrolling up once to check something, her face giving very little away. When she finally looked up, her face wasn't guilty, and it wasn't angry either. It was something closer to tired, like I'd finally shown her a version of the relationship she'd known about all along and had simply been waiting for me to catch up to. Why do you write down love? 6 words, delivered quietly, no theatrics, no raised voice, and somehow those 6 words did more damage than any fight we'd ever had. I opened my mouth to answer and found I didn't have anything ready, because I hadn't expected the conversation to turn on a question rather than an argument. It's not about love, Lorna, I finally managed. It's about me having less than I thought I had, and not knowing until now. She shook her head slowly, like I'd missed the point entirely. You think I planned this? You think I sat down and decided, I will take from this old Australian man? I told her I didn't know what she'd planned, and what she hadn't, and that not knowing was its own kind of problem. Underneath her question was an assumption I hadn't fully seen until that exact second. That questioning the cost of something was the same as questioning whether it was real. That in her mind, and maybe in a lot of minds I'd never had to understand before coming here, love that gets counted stops being love and starts being suspicion. I sat with that question for longer than I've sat with most questions in my life. I still don't have a clean answer to it. But I've come to believe the real question underneath hers was never about love at all. It was about whether I was allowed to have limits, and whether asking for them made me generous or made me small. I told her, as gently as I could manage, that I didn't think what we'd built was a relationship anymore. I told her it had become a household budget with a girlfriend attached to the top of it, and that I'd let it happen because I was scared of being alone again, more than I was scared of going broke, and that neither of us could keep pretending those were the same thing. She sat quietly for a while, staring at the spreadsheet still open on the laptop between us, and then she said something I hadn't expected. Maybe you're right that it became too much. But you never said stop, Dennis. Not once, in 2 years. You always said yes, and then you're angry now that I believed you meant it. I didn't have a clean response to that either, because there was a hard, uncomfortable truth sitting inside it. I had never once, in 2 years, said the word no out loud to any of them. She didn't cry. She didn't argue the numbers. Not really. Not after that one exchange. She packed 2 bags over the next 3 days, quietly, without theater, and moved back in with her mother inland. Bing and Randy simply stopped appearing after that, the way staff do when the contract ends. Though no contract had ever technically existed between any of us, just an unspoken understanding that dissolved the moment its funding did. I saw Randy once more, months later, at the market, and he nodded at me, not unkindly, and I nodded back, and neither of us said anything, because there wasn't really anything left to say between an employer and an employee who'd never used those words with each other. Precious messaged me twice afterward about the shop inventory I'd already paid for, asking if I still wanted a cut of future sales, and I didn't reply either time, not out of cruelty, just because I no longer knew what honest answer to give her. The weeks after felt strange in a way I hadn't expected, not devastating, not the collapse I'd have predicted a year earlier if you'd told me this was coming. Mostly I felt tired, and a little embarrassed, and oddly relieved in a way that took me a while to admit to myself, the way you feel after finally putting down something heavy you'd stopped noticing you were carrying. I called Craig and told him the whole thing, the real version, not the edited one I'd been giving him for a year, over video calls where I always found a reason to change the subject before the money came up. He was quiet for a moment after I finished, longer than I expected, and then he said, "Dad, you're allowed to want simple. You don't have to apologize for that." I don't know why that landed as hard as it did, coming from my own son, a man I'd taught to fix a leaking tap before he could ride a bike, but it did, and I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment after he said it, not trusting my voice to answer straight away. I still live in La Union. People assume, when they hear a story like this, that a man packs up and flies home in disgrace, tail between his legs, back to the same gray retirement he was trying to escape in the first place. Maybe some do. I didn't want to let one relationship decide where the rest of my life happened, and I'd come to genuinely love this stretch of coast. The sound of it, the pace of it, even after everything. I moved to a smaller unit further from the main strip, cheaper, quieter, no room for anyone's inventory boxes, even if I'd wanted them there. I cut my expenses back down to something that actually matches my pension, wrote out a proper budget for the first time since I'd left Brisbane, and stuck to it the way I used to stick to a job spec, because a job done sloppy always costs more in the end than a job done right the first time. I've kept the spreadsheet, updated now, 1 column, 1 name, Dennis. Rent, food, the odd flight home, a little put aside each month for Craig's kids, who I've started calling my retirement fund, with a laugh that isn't entirely a joke. I check it every Sunday morning with my coffee, the way some men check a football score, and there's a strange comfort in it I never expected to find, a small private proof that I'm the one steering the boat again. I surf most mornings still, worse than I used to. My knees have opinions about that now that they never used to have. I still have a beer at sunset most days, usually alone, sometimes with Trevor, who never once says I told you so, which I respect more than he probably knows. The coaster plan mostly held, in the end, once I stripped everything off it that was never mine to carry in the first place. I don't hate Lorna, for what it's worth, and I've stopped needing to decide whether she ever loved me, because I've realized that's not actually the question that matters to me anymore. I think, most days, that some part of what we had was real, and that another part of it was simply what happens when one person's loneliness meets another person's obligations, and nobody involved has the tools or the courage to draw a clear line between the two. The question that actually matters, the one I ask myself now more than any other, is whether I loved myself enough, back then, to say no even once, to Bing, to Randy, to Precious's next batch of inventory, to Lorna herself, when the number kept climbing past what any sensible man should have allowed. I didn't, not for a long time. And that's on me as much as anyone, maybe more. Trevor and I have a standing Thursday now, a beer at his dive shop after his last group comes up from the reef, and it's become one of the steadier fixtures of my week out here, steadier in some ways than the relationship that used to fill that space. He asked me once, a few months after everything ended, whether I regretted any of it, the 2 years, the money, the whole arrangement, and I had to think about it properly before I answered, because the easy answer, the bitter one, wasn't actually true. I told him I regretted the not asking more than the giving. I regretted that I'd let a fear of seeming stingy, or foreign, or unwelcome override every instinct I'd spent 63 years developing about when a job is running to spec and when it's quietly running over budget without anyone flagging it. These days when I meet other blokes out here, fresh off the plane, full of the same beer coaster plans I once had, eyes bright with the same hope I walked in with, I tell them one thing, and I mean it as kindly as I know how, because I remember exactly how it feels to hear it and not want it to be true. Write it down. Not because love needs an invoice, and not because every family here is running the same play. Most aren't. Most of what happens between people in this country is exactly as decent as it looks, and I've met enough good, honest people out here since to know that. But because a man who won't look honestly at a number is usually a man who's already decided not to look honestly at himself, and sooner or later, one way or another, that bill always comes due. I paid mine in full. I just wish I'd read the invoice a year and a half earlier than I did.